Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final National Stock Assessment Science Seminar of the year. My name is Bailey, and I coordinate this monthly seminar series that highlights interesting advances and topics in stock assessment science. We are starting to plan the 2025 lineup, and there are still a few spots open. If you'd like to share your work or nominate someone whose work you'd like to see featured, please feel free to reach out to me. And today we are excited to have Dr. Matt Damiano with us. Matt is a research fish biologist in the Caribbean Fisheries Branch of the Southeast Fisheries Science Center's Sustainable Fisheries Division. He holds a PhD in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology from North Carolina State University and is a former NMFS-SeaGrant Population and Ecosystem Dynamics Fellow. When he's not thinking about fish, he likes long walks, video games, and petting cats. And in today's seminar, Matt will discuss the application of a size structure management strategy evaluation tool in the southeast region of the United States. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Matt. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Bai. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and share my screen and get started. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is going to include a really brief refresher on management strategy evaluation. I suspect most of our attendees are familiar with MSE in some form. And then I'm going to talk to you about the actual development of the size structured MSE framework, and then show you a couple of applications. The first to U.S. South Atlantic black sea bass, and then the second to U.S. Caribbean yellowtail snapper, and finally conclude this talk with some thoughts on future use of this tool and some functionality I'd like to see built into the framework. So, what is management strategy evaluation? It is a computer simulation approach for testing different management options over a wide range of possible realities for the fishery and the population. The reason we do MSE is to stress test management procedures, or MPs as I'll call them for the rest of the talk, against a set of objectives and given a range of uncertainty. The other purpose is to find those MPs that meet objectives and balance trade-offs between them in the long term. Now, your mileage on this metaphor may vary depending on your level of investment in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, but I like to think of stress testing MPs in terms of the fight between King Arthur and the Black Knight. As you make your way through these panels, and if those of you know how this scene ends, the metaphorical MP is left standing, although nominally. There are a few different types of MSE that I think are worth discussing before I jump into these case studies. Generally, we think of three different kinds of MSE, depending on the situation and the resources available. In descending order of resource intensive to less resource intensive, we have full stakeholder MSEs, in which you actually have stakeholders participating in the MSE process along with an MSE technical team who meet multiple times to explore and refine objectives, build operating models, create the simulation framework, establish a small group that meets with the technical team many more times to guide the simulation exercise. This often takes several years and involves a lot of investment as far as time and monetary resources. The step below that is an intermediate MSE, where you may have some kind of stakeholder input, but it's not necessarily going to be iterative or participatory the way a full one is. The black sea bass case study I'm going to be talking about is one such example of this type of MSE. And then finally, we have desk MSEs, which are computer exercises that usually have little to no stakeholder input whatsoever. This is going to be the kind of exercise the yellowtail snapper example represents. Another pertinent question I think is worth addressing is when we should do MSE. In general, it's considered wise to pursue an MSE when an MP is not achieving existing objectives. And in general, adopting an untested strategy tends to be risky and can have negative consequences for the natural resource and the people who depend on them. Other situations when MSE should be undertaken include when uncertainty threatens the integrity of the current management approach, and when we have these so-called wicked problems where you may have multiple stakeholders with potentially competing objectives and unclear future conditions. These two underlined situations are the ones I'm going to be focusing on with the case studies I discussed today. Some other situations where MSE might be wise is when a binding policy is going to be adopted or when you have stakeholders with no representation in management. Here in the South Atlantic US, there's a very high potential for these sorts of wicked problems. The makeup of the participation in fisheries in this region has shifted over time away from being a split between commercial and recreational to actually favoring recreational quite a bit. 68% of trips and 68% of catch come from recreational fisheries, and recreational fishing is the dominant source of mortality in the South Atlantic US. We also have uncertain future conditions, particularly for multiple grouper stocks, where we've seen a sort of recruitment failure, which would threaten the integrity of the current management approach. So for any of you who may have seen my talk at SCS 8, you may have seen this figure already. It's a compilation of estimated recruitment for 6 different grouper species in the South Atlantic US. So in the South Atlantic US, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council is responsible for managing 64 federal marine fisheries, of which 55 are managed under the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan. A lot of these stocks occupy the same habitat, and the open access recreational fishery operates on many of these stocks, which overlap in space and time. And so you may be fishing for one stock that's in good condition and end up catching a lot of others. And so this alarming trend that we've seen is that there are lots of stocks for which recruitment has declined. In the case of black sea bass, one of the subject of today's talk, we see this precipitous decline following about 2010 up until 2019. In the South Atlantic US, the current MP, or rather the current harvest control rule, is generally comprised of an input control derived from typically F-based proxies. For many of the assessments, we assume a null recruitment model because steepness tends to be difficult to estimate and often just goes up to the upper bound. And so FMSY ends up being inestimable. And so we rely on these spawning potential ratio based proxies, such as the F that achieves 40% of the spawning potential ratio, aka F40. And this is used in combination with a number of management measures like minimum size limits, bag limits for recreational trips, trip limits for recreational trips, vessel limits for commercial trips. And it's also worth noting that this is all based on a single species stock assessment framework for relatively data-rich instances. And so over here on the right, I have essentially how this control rule operates. It's a threshold control rule in which you have a level of F, a limit level of F you don't want to pass, after which overfishing would be occurring, and then a level of stock size or spawning stock biomass past which you don't want to go because then your stock would be overfished. So what we sought to do was conduct an intermediate MSE for South Atlantic black sea bass as well as Atlantic cobia. Our goals for this project were first to find out what South Atlantic fishers want. So what do our commercial fishermen and recreational anglers want from these fisheries? And then develop a generalized MSE tool for application to a wide range of stocks and systems with size-structured dynamics, and then apply that tool in order to evaluate the performance of some MPs against management objectives with explicit consideration of recreational fishing objectives, then identify and evaluate trade-offs where they occur and project changes in the fisheries. So how we accomplished these goals first were we conducted a set of semi-structured interviews with several recreational anglers and commercial fishermen to learn about what they want, meaning what their conceptual objectives are, but also what kinds of possible management action using the levers available would achieve those objectives. And then we wanted to know how fishers have changed their fishing behavior in response to past action. So to accomplish our second goal, we developed a size-structured MSE tool for those 2 southeast marine fisheries, black sea bass and cobia. The application resulted in 2 separate MSEs, one for each stock, and we chose black sea bass and cobia as our test case study so we could compare the performance of some generalized South Atlantic US MPs across stocks with different life histories, different fishery compositions, and stock status. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on black sea bass, largely because I think the results of the black sea bass MSc were a lot more interesting, and I'd like to be able to talk to you about some of the ongoing yellowtail snapper work we're doing. Some quick background before I move forward, though, on black sea bass. They're a largely sedentary reef fish and a protogynous hermaphrodite. They have a maximum lifespan of about 25 years and are distributed throughout the East Coast U.S. from Cape Hatteras, North Carolina to Southeast Florida. They're one of those species managed under the Snapper Group, or FMP, by the South Atlantic Council. And it's worth noting that the recreational sectors for black sea bass are made up of not only private recreational anglers who may have their own vessels or fish from shore, but also a for-hire recreational fleet consisting of charter vessels and headboats. Historically, the amount of catch coming out of commercial and recreational fisheries was approximately 50-50, but it's grown to a point where the amount of catch coming from the recreational sector is actually closer to 90%. There's also some fundamental differences between these two fisheries in that management measures for the commercial fishery include an 11-inch size limit, in many cases to accommodate the size of traps used in commercial fishing, as well as vessel limits. And then in the recreational sector, a 13-inch size limit, minimum size limit, is imposed in combination with bag limits and trip limits. So going back to the semi-structured interviews, we conducted these over the phone during summer of 2020, which was not an especially auspicious time to be doing interviews, but at least we had the phone. We did 22 interviews with recreational anglers and 6 with commercial fishermen. And what we learned was that recreational anglers consistently identified wanting longer seasons and being able to catch larger fish as conceptual objectives. What was really interesting about this part of the study was that conceptual objectives were sometimes in agreement among both commercial fishermen and recreational anglers. They both wanted to catch as many fish as they could, reduce the number of dead discards, which I alluded to being an issue with the snapper grouper fishery, and then particularly wanting to maintain opportunity and keep the fishery open. As far as management levers to achieve these objectives, one thing that came up consistently was exploring alternative size limits because of that inequity between the size limits in the commercial and recreational fishery. As far as how fishing behavior changed, largely it really didn't. It sounded like most folks would just switch targets. And given that the snapper grouper fishery has a lot of different species to fish, when one closes, another that might be in better shape, one can just switch targets to. Another really interesting thing is that conservation and sustainability of the fishery consistently came up when asked about what folks valued about the black sea bass fishery. And so as far as the size-structured MSE tool, it's configured like a lot of MSEs in the sense that we have an operating model to simulate population dynamics, the fisheries, and the process of data collection. And then we sort of have everything else falling under the umbrella of the MP. This includes a size-structured estimation model that was based on a size-structured assessment developed by Jay Chow, and then an implementation model that uses the estimated reference points from the estimation model and applies management action and then projects forward in time. The size-structured dynamics are based on an equation that is quite similar to age-structured dynamics, with the notable difference being this growth transition matrix term G sub K, comma K. So abundance at size for each year was calculated as a function of abundance at size that survived total mortality and then grew using this growth transition matrix and added new fish to the population during the previous year. Mortality was assumed to occur instantaneously throughout the year, and natural mortality was assumed constant and time invariant. We provided a matrix of F values by fleet based on the most recent stock assessment, and fishery selectivity for each fleet was assumed to be either logistic or double logistic. A minimum of 2 fleets was modeled for the black sea bass fishery, with a discard fleet included as a third. And then the growth transition matrix is governed by a mean and a variance. The mean is this expected change in a growth increment based on the von Bertalanffy growth function. And it generates an upper triangular matrix describing the probabilities of fish in one size bin transitioning to a different size bin. This is a bit different from age-structured dynamics in that fish can grow into a different size bin other than the one that immediately comes after it. And only positive growth was allowed. We didn't allow any shrinkage. We also assumed no functional stock recruitment relationship, meaning we used the null recruitment model similar to the stock assessment. This only required a single mean recruitment parameter and a vector of annual deviations from mean recruitment. And then we calculated spawning stock biomass as a function of the simulated abundance at size that experienced mortality up to the month of peak spawning, multiplied by weight and a logistic maturity function. Now, black sea bass is a sex changer, and so the maturity function assumes that a certain number of fish past a certain size, whether male or female, are considered mature fish. So spawning stock biomass is assumed to be comprised of potentially both male and female fish. We're not really sure about whether there's sperm limitation in the system, and so that's an assumption consistent with the assessment. We used the Baronoff catch equation to calculate the time series of catch at age for each fleet from the simulated abundance at size. And we included a single unitless index of abundance, which was meant to model the combined video and trap survey that's conducted in the U.S. South Atlantic. So while we began developing this model, we were assuming conditions based on the 2018 black sea bass stock assessment. But last year, the most recent stock assessment was concluded and showed that the stock was overfished, and overfishing was occurring, driven predominantly by that weak recruitment, but also dead discards from the recreational fishery. You can be fishing on a perfectly healthy stock out here, but still end up catching a lot of other stocks that aren't in great condition because of that spatiotemporal overlap in habitat. And so the MSC uses operating models that were parameterized to account for estimated population dynamics from that recent stock assessment that was conducted using the Beaufort assessment model. And so the parameters we used were coming from essentially a correctly specified age-structured model. And this is something of a simplification, since that model includes a more complicated fleet structure, and potentially more than one index of relative abundance. We simulated population and fishery processes over 1990 to 2021 to represent the historic period. And each operating model was projected forward from that historic period 10 times at 5-year assessment intervals, totaling 50 years. So it projected 50 years into the future. And during each assessment interval, that size-structured estimation model was fitted to the historical and projected data to estimate fishing mortality-based reference points, proxy reference points, to form the model-based harvest control rules used for management. And so each MP was comprised of the estimation model, the harvest control rule, and management measure. And so specifically, we looked at two different recreational minimum size limits for black sea bass, 11 inches and 13 inches. This resulted in 5 MPs, which I'll describe momentarily, including F0, where we wanted to take a look at the time it would take for the stock to rebuild. And we looked at it under 3 alternative states of recruitment to try and account for population process error. And so the 5 MPs we considered were essentially the status quo, in which we have a assumed target of F40 with a 13-inch size limit, which was applied to both the commercial and the recreational fisheries due to some software limitations I'll explain momentarily. We looked at 75% of F40 with that 13-inch size limit, F0, and then the alternative management measures, so F40 with the 11-inch size limit and F40 with 75% of F40 with the 11-inch size limit. And the 3 recruitment conditions were assuming average recruitment over the historic period, recent recruitment during 2012 to 2021, which included some peaks, but also that large trough at the end, and then low recruitment to account for that really low period of recruitment, or the period when the slope of recruitment was steep and low, resulting in a total of 15 unique operating models. We did 200 simulations or replicates and measured our results in medians. We included stochastic deviations in mean recruitment, which we saved from the first 200 iterations with the status quo operating model and reused them to ensure balanced design. We included a CV of 0.27 to account for observation error in the survey index, and we also included implementation error. So during each projection, the amount of fishing was allocated to each fleet based on a draw from a normal distribution, which used the mean and standard deviation of the fractions of F by fleet over the previous 10 years. And so here's where I'm going to delve a bit into some software caveats. So we don't actually have an ACL calculation in the operating model. Rather, it takes the proxy reference point and multiplies it by this allocation vector, including implementation error, to give F by fleet to project over time. And so in addition to that, we also made the simulation framework such that the estimation model only expected a single set of logistic selectivity parameters. We probably could have spoofed this by using a different kind of selectivity function to approximate a logistic, but we didn't think of that at the time. And so essentially we assume equal selectivity, which is another reason it's important to look at both the 11-inch size limit and the 13-inch size limit in terms of our reference grid here. And so as far as our objectives, because we were pursuing a intermediate MSE without iterative feedback, we had to interpret and what I call partially operationalize the objectives, such that we had objectives to measure the simulation testing against and could come up with some performance metrics that made sense. And so we had essentially 5 objectives: prevent overfished status, which we measured in terms of the proportion of median spawning stock biomass that was greater than the minimum stock size threshold during the last 40 years of projections. Maximize catch, and we measured this in the median annual number of fish landed by each fleet during the last 40 years of the projections. Reduce the number of dead discards, which we measured as the median annual number of fish discarded dead. Maximize season length, which we measured as the median annual relative catch per unit effort by particularly for the recreational fleet. And I'll dig into that a bit momentarily. And then finally, increase the availability of large fish, which we created the following performance metric for. Measure in terms of the proportion of the median annual population abundance at size that is larger or equal to the minimum size limit, according to which OM we were using. We also didn't conduct this exercise with the intention of directly providing management advice. And so our performance metrics, you can see, are not really probabilistic. They're really more meant to be compared to one another in a relativistic sense or against the status quo. Oh, I forgot about those animations. So I said I was going to talk about this season length because we are working in an annual model. So it's worth talking about some of the assumptions that we made to be able to measure this performance metric. In the South Atlantic, we assume that catch per unit effort is likely to be inversely proportional to the length of season because the more fish are going to get caught per unit effort, the sooner the sector is going to attain its ACL. But if we hold that F is equal to catchability multiplied by effort, assume that catchability is constant and that effort is equal to F divided by catchability, and assume that we are fishing at the rate at which we're fishing is maxed out, we can multiply the catch per unit effort for a given MP by 1 over the CPUE from the status quo MP, in which case the catchability terms cancel, and that assumption that F is maxed out would entail that if CPUE goes up, the season length is technically longer because you can't fish harder. So the only way to catch more fish per unit effort is to fish longer. Now, these are fairly strong assumptions, and there's an alternative interpretation to some of the results that were produced that I'll discuss with you very shortly. So without further ado, let's jump right into the simulation results. So what I have here are by column the population dynamics and the number of recruits, the number of fish, and spawning stock biomass in mature weight in kilograms by average recruitment condition, recent recruitment condition in the center, and the low recruitment condition on the right. And I realize this is likely to be an eye exam for most of you watching online, but each of these lines on the line plot are color-coded to match with one of the 5 MPs. In red, we have 75% of F40. In the yellowish color, we have 75% of F40 with the 11-inch size limit. Green is the no fishing scenario. Blue is F40, and the hot pink is F40 with the 11-inch size limit. So the ones without size limit specified are the ones with the 13-inch size limit. And so another thing I want to draw your attention to is that no matter what scenario, I'm sorry, let me back up here. So what we see first of all is that under the F0 scenario, we see abundance grow larger than any of the other MPs that allow fishing, but not quite up to the historic levels, although it does rebuild the stock relatively quickly in about 10 to 20 years down in the bottom left. This is pretty consistent with some of the other MSC work that has been done, including on black sea bass by Cassidy Peterson, and most recently for the South Atlantic Council in a multi-species snapper grouper MSC. Under the low recruitment scenarios, you can still see, or in the recent recruitment scenario, you can still see the population rebuild within that time frame to approximately historical levels. But in the low recruitment scenario, it's not likely to rebuild to historical levels. And it's actually in the recent and low recruitment scenarios where your MPs that allow fishing at whatever level start to get you closer to that minimum stock size threshold on the black line there in all of the SSB plots. And note the difference in the magnitude between the historical period. That's due to the difference in selectivity allowing for the 11-inch or 13-inch size limit. And so looking at the landings associated with each of these, again, you do see that difference in magnitude in the historic period. That's still due to that change in selectivity over that time. But regardless of what the recruitment scenario is, none of these MPs are going to achieve landings that are even close to the historic levels here. And under most of the recruitment conditions, you still have a lot of dead discards, especially those associated with levels of higher fishing mortality. And then moving right along into some of the other performance metrics, I want to draw your attention to the bottom right here where we have the relative catch per unit effort, which we're using as the proxy for season length. And then we have the proportion of the population that's larger than the minimum size limit, which we measure kind of out of a scale of 0 to 1. So concerning the recreational relative catch per unit effort, what this would suggest is that those management procedures that have the lower size limit and the lower size limit, so the 11-inch size limit, are going to result in longer seasons. Again, this is due to that assumption that if you're fishing at a maximum, it's going to take you longer to catch these fish. But the other interpretation that you could go with here that's equally valid is assuming that these scenarios in which you have actually higher numbers of discards and lower numbers of landings are going to result in longer seasons because it's much harder to catch fish that you can keep. This actually illustrates a really interesting trade-off between season length and the magnitude of dead discards. What I thought was really interesting about the proportion of the population that was larger than that minimum size length is across all the recruitment conditions, we saw that the MPs that lowered F to 75% of F40, regardless of the size limit, resulted in a larger proportion of legal sized fish, suggesting that lowering the amount of effort, or F, is what's going to result in more larger fish available rather than just implementing a different size limit. Looking at this a slightly different way, what I have here are spider plots of the median of the medians across all years and all 200 iterations to sort of try and illustrate where these trade-offs occurred. Though I should let you know that the directionality varies here. So, for example, the recreational season length RSL, the higher, the better in this case. As with stock status, so the higher you are, the further away you are from being in an overfished condition. But the higher your dead discards, that's not necessarily a good thing. So if we assume that average recruitment conditions are going to persist, or that the system is going to return to average recruitment conditions away from this period of low recruitment or recruitment failure, then those scenarios that lower the amount of F are going to have stock status that is furthest away from an overfished condition. The 75% of F40 with the 11-inch size limit is going to achieve that longest season length, although, again, that other interpretation is equally valid. And there's a clear trade-off between the magnitude of landings and stock status. So the higher your landings are, the lower your stock status is going to be. Also, the harder you fish, the more dead discards there are likely to be, which may again inflate your season length, but isn't necessarily desirable. And a lot of these advantages or a lot of the positive effects of strategies under average recruitment really do erode under these lower recruitment scenarios. Stock status starts to drop lower pretty much no matter what. Dead discards too, but that's really just a function of the amount of F in that reduced recruitment scenario. Okay, I believe I've rambled a bit too much on those figures, and so I will summarize. We didn't really see trade-offs between the sectors because of those aligned objectives. What we saw is that you generally have a trade-off between spawning stock biomass or stock status and your magnitude of landings, which is fairly typical. And then we also have that potential trade-off between recreational season length and dead discards, depending on your interpretation. But one of the most striking results is that really without better recruitment, the stock is not going to rebuild, and really none of these strategies are going to achieve objectives. And even under average recruitment conditions, which were the most optimistic, landings aren't going to be able to reach historic levels. What was clear was that the MPs that lowered F were the only means of substantially reducing the number of dead discards. And then finally, reducing the size limits to 11 inches didn't really affect the size structure because those fish above 11 inches were going to be discarded in those models where the size limit was 13 inches. And so what I concluded here was that input controls are likely going to be the most effective strategy to meet the dead discard reduction objective after or if the stock rebuilds. And although we used a shortcut approach to input controls by controlling F directly, it's still fairly clear that some sort of cap on the amount of recreational effort is the only way that the dead discard problem is going to be addressed. We also saw that high minimum size limits are not likely achieving the intended effect because of fishing on that multi-stock complex and the subsequent discard issue. And this means that that open access nature of the fishery is likely to be untenable without some sort of multi-species approach. And finally, finally, that the season length and proportion above the minimum size limits can be useful ways to measure MP performance with respect to recreational fishing objectives and potentially act as useful proxies for angler satisfactions. And I also want to point out that we also made that assumption about constant catchability in the season length proxy, and that is very likely to be violated under these changing conditions. So some more consideration into how we measure season length is probably warranted. And I also want to point out that these conclusions are remarkably consistent with those of the South Atlantic Council's Snapper Group, or MSC, if those of you attending today tuned into the presentation yesterday. So it's nice to see that validation. We published this study in a couple of different papers, the first on the semi-structured interviews and the second on the actual simulation testing. So feel free to check those out if you want to read about those in more detail. And so with this last portion of the talk, I want to talk about the work that we've started doing with this tool in the U.S. Caribbean. So the challenges in the U.S. Caribbean are a bit different from those in the South Atlantic. We have island-based fishery management, and so when we have to conduct a stock assessment, we really have to conduct 3. And one of the issues we're running into with even our most data-rich stock assessment is stock status is typically inestimable. It's a really data-limited management system where we have in some cases data that our stakeholders don't really believe is accurate. We have an open biological system that's being treated as discrete and independent portions of that system. We have external recruitment to that same shelf, for example. And I suppose I should back up and mention that the U.S. Caribbean, for everybody's information, includes Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which are St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. And the 3 island platforms that we have are Puerto Rico, the combined St. Thomas, St. John area, and St. Croix. And so one of the concerns that we heard earlier this year was when you can't estimate stock status, is using a proxy or just an F-based reference point a good way forward, given the concerns about potential non-stationarity in recruitment? And so part of the motivation for doing this was to test against that kind of condition. And so this exploratory MSE that we've done and are still actually working on had one goal, which was really to simulation test a suite of F-based MP against uncertainty, specifically in recruitment. So given that we often don't know stock status, and indeed often we don't really know stock status even if we think we know it, we wanted to determine what the robustness of those F-based proxies like F40 look like to recruitment non-stationarity. This is somewhat inspired by some other simulation work that's being led by Kyle Schertzer, and I've been lucky enough to contribute to. And so our study approach uses areas as fleets to try and distinguish between the island platforms. For yellowtail snapper, it's just Puerto Rico and St. Thomas, St. John. Otherwise, the approach to setting up the operating model is just about the same as what I went through with South Atlantic black sea bass. It's based on the ongoing stock assessments being conducted as part of CDAR 84 as well. And this is truly a desk MSC. We haven't had any stakeholder input, and there's only one simple objective here to try and meet, which is prevent overfish status. So we looked at 4 MPs, F40, 75% of F40, F40 with something of a biomass threshold or backstop, and then iTarget, an empirical indexed MP, where we set iTarget to the highest level of the survey index. So it just has 2 fleets, the 2 areas, Puerto Rico, St. Thomas, St. John, 1 survey to represent the National Coral Reef Monitoring Program, Reef Visual Census Survey. And then we looked at 3 recruitment scenarios, an average recruitment and low recruitment similar to black sea bass, but then a non-stationary mean recruitment. So every 10 years in that 50-year projection, the mean is going to shift up or down. And so, under average recruitment conditions, we see that during the historic period, abundance drops a little bit, and then it kind of levels. Or I'm sorry, recruitment drops a little bit and then levels out under those average conditions. Abundance under all of these is relatively similar, although I target being set to that highest level ends up being a really generous fraction of F40, so something like 65% of F40, so that attains the highest abundance and subsequently the highest biomass. Now, some of you might be raising your eyebrow at the amount of biomass here, and not without good reason. One of the things that we still really need to address in the estimation model framework is including a sex ratio. That estimation model was actually built for a sex changer, northern shrimp, and then applied to another sex changer in black sea bass. So in a way, we really do need to revisit this before it's ready for prime time. And then that biomass threshold in the black line is just set to the average spawning stock biomass during the historic period. So at least under these assumptions, all of these MPs are achieving that objective. Although it's noteworthy that the SSB really jumps in about 2030 for the F40 with the biomass threshold rule, indicating that somewhere among the different iterations, it did manage to drop below that threshold. And we see that if we look at the landings for Puerto Rico and St. Thomas, St. John, which are generally maintained at pretty low levels. But right at the beginning here, it looks like that F40 control rule dropped below our definition of an overfish of a minimum stock size threshold proxy, and then rebounds to give us some higher catch. Yellowtail snapper, for reference, is a really fast growing fish, and so that's why we kind of see that rebound there. F40 and 75% F40 perform pretty comparably, and then the I target being set to such a conservative level nets the lowest level of landings and consequently the highest abundance in spawning stock biomass. Sorry, I'm barreling through this. I just want to be mindful of time and I want to be able to answer any questions that folks have. And so under low recruitment conditions, we see, what we'd expect. Abundance is maintained at a much, much lower level. Spawning stock biomass is still technically above the threshold most of the time, but we see that it breaches it again if we fish at F40 with a control rule to close the fishery and then reopen once it's back above it. We see that same kind of corresponding behavior in the landings, although for St. Thomas and St. John, it looks like the fishery actually has to close multiple times and gets a little bit of a bump with each successive closure, which has some interesting impact on the sum of the results, which I'll show you in a bit. Now, the most interesting case is where we looked at this non-stationarity in mean recruitment, where the recruitment was either good or bad or middle of the road. And we see that abundance and spawning stock biomass fluctuate accordingly. We see similar behavior to the previous models and a slight bump at the beginning in the F40 with the threshold rule, indicative of that same triggering of the rule. We see this a lot less though here in the sense that it really only closes maybe twice throughout the time series and then rebounds really high. Arguably making it one of the most responsive to these non-stationary recruitment conditions. And so here's just proof that I'm learning to make better MSE visuals as I learn how to develop the software. We looked at the average MP performance across each of the four MPs on the x-axis and SSB on the Y with the colors associated with the different recruitment conditions. And you can kind of see where you would have the highest probability of attaining what level of spawning stock biomass according to the recruitment condition. We see that iTarget has the highest potential for high spawning stock biomass, which we would expect given that it's set at such a conservative level. When we look at the landings, however, this is where I think it gets really interesting because we see that some of the highest level of landings for Puerto Rico are being driven by those non-stationary or average conditions and using the F40 with the biomass threshold rule. Same thing with St. Thomas and St. John, although F40 also achieves relatively high landings, though a bit less of the time. And so the preliminary conclusions from this is under non-stationary recruitment conditions, F40, some similar proxies, and iTarget used to scale that F really do achieve the intended effect, which is if we don't know the underlying stock status or biomass, we can see that it gets reduced to a target level and is therefore likely to be robust to recruitment non-stationarity, which is technically something we saw in the MSE and something that we're seeing in those simulations that Kyle Schertzer is leading. The most interesting result to me is that if stakeholders are willing to accept it, the biomass threshold rule can offer higher total landings overall, depending on their appetite for closing the fishery periodically or switching to another target if that's an option. And this all supports the idea that for data limited stocks especially, we don't necessarily need to know stock status to set these target fishing levels, which is really what we control anyway. And so, as I alluded to earlier, there's some future functionality I'd like to see built in here. The estimation model needs some tweaking. It really needs that sex ratio for species like yellowtail snapper so we can accurately gauge whether or not we meet that prevent overfished status or prevent breaching some undesirable level of spawning stock biomass. We really couldn't, given that it's assuming both male and female biomass are mature in the current configuration. I'd also like to add more off-the-shelf index-based empirical MPs, which we suspect will be quite successful in a data-limited system like the U.S. Caribbean. I also would like to explore some non-stationarity in growth and survival, although a publication that Kyle Schertzer, Eric Williams, and I just published earlier this week suggests that those SBR proxies like F40 are generally robust to non-stationarity in growth and survival. Another limitation is the simulation framework currently can't accommodate any missing data, and that's something I'd really like to remedy since realistically we're often dealing with gaps in these data streams, even in the South Atlantic U.S. where we have more data-rich data streams. And then also I'd like to see social science and socioeconomic studies used to inform non-commercial fleet dynamics in the Caribbean because we really don't have much information on them and we have no data on them. But MSE is a great opportunity to try and build a reality in which we do have some understanding of it, potentially based on these other less quantitative studies. And then subsequently come up with some performance metrics for non-commercial fishing objectives in the U.S. Caribbean, which are likely to be a lot different from what we have in the South Atlantic U.S. And so finally, I kind of breezed past the motivation for using a size-structured framework instead of an age-structured framework. And so I want to leave with some thoughts. I've thought a lot about how much this approach really matters from the perspective of using MSE or the MP approach. I don't really think it matters that much, especially seeing how consistent the results of the black sea bass MSE were with other age structured MSE exercises. I think it's nice to have this framework, especially for crustaceans where age might not be a good means of accounting for growth. And while we know that growth for fishes is driven by both age and size structured processes, if you're going to parameterize a model with age-based von Bertalanffy growth parameters like L infinity and K, then if you have constant natural mortality and constant fishing mortality, the estimate should probably be really, really close. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the Marine Fisheries Initiative Program for funding this work, the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, Atlantic and Caribbean Fisheries Branches for their support, and my co-authors on the manuscripts, Kyle Schertzer, Jay Chow, Bethany Wager, and Alex Rocco. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, we have our first question. Aloha, Matt. Great seminar. Question on BSB slide 21. Landings seem to fluctuate every other year. What is causing that?
Just to clarify, is that in the historic period where you see those jagged edges? If so, that's a good question because the landings really should just be a function of the simulated population dynamics. So I suspect that it's a combination of the recruitment deviations and the deviations in F that we borrowed, or rather used, to parameterize the operating models.
Okay, yeah. And Aaron followed up and said, yes, it was the historic period.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Aaron.
Okay, we had a question come in the audience chat. The Northeast population of BSB is doing really well. What do you think is causing the disconnect?
Uh, that's a good question. I think it's for one strong evidence that those are two different populations, but I really think that the results of the most recent stock assessment quantified the major issues, which is that you have really poor recruitment conditions, which what exactly is driving that, it remains unclear and under investigation. And then you have the pattern of discarding, just people catching and releasing black sea bass in such a magnitude that even despite their relatively hardy rate of survival when released alive, just a large magnitude of discarding behavior is leading to the discards, and that's what's keeping the population at a low level. I think it's just really how the fishery operates. It's a fundamentally different fishery up north than it is in the south.
And then our next question is, given the large number of stocks with low recruitment, why did MSC not consider possibility of an effect of spawners on recruitment?
You know, that's a very fair question. The short answer is I got looped into the poor recruitment question right about when I finished writing up this manuscript, and so it's a good question, and I think we should look at that. Although for most of the grouper stocks, snapper and grouper stocks, it seems like their dynamics are primarily recruitment driven, with no clear evidence of a relationship between spawners and recruits.
Is the code for the MSE and estimation model available on GitHub?
It is. Thank you so much for reminding me. I should put that in the chat. I think it's available from the DOI for the simulation testing publication, and I do intend to put the yellowtail snapper code with changes to both the operating model framework and estimation framework on there as well.
Our next question, to compare among MPs, do you use a tuning parameter so that MPs can achieve the same goal and then be evaluated for robustness?
No, it does not. I just recently became aware of that process, and so that's not something I considered when we were putting together the study design. But that's definitely something I'm interested in doing in future MSc, to sort of make all else being equal, in a sense, to see if those can achieve the objective. And I'm seeing in the chat a request for the Scherzer et al. Paper. Yes, let me put that in there.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem.
And then our next question is, apologies if you mentioned this. What is the assessment period? Did you assume an annual, and do you expect each procedure to perform the same under a 3 and 5 year assessment cycle?
Great question. I think I may have glossed over that. The assessment period is every 5 years. And so we didn't look at the difference between a 3 or a 5 year assessment cycle.
All right. Sounds like we answered everything everyone wanted to know.
Okay. Well,
Thank
thank
you,
you very
Matt.
much.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for sharing your work with us. And thank you, Bai, for organizing this event. Audience, please join us again in January for the next National Stock Assessment Science Seminar. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.